Blood soaked through the bandage faster than Elena could replace it. Callum's breathing came in short, ragged pulls, and every few seconds his whole body shook as though something inside him were trying to break free. Around them, the forest floor was churned with mud and broken branches, evidence of the fight that had ended only minutes before. Elena pressed both hands against the wound on his side, her fingers slick and trembling, while smoke drifted between the trees from a fire that had caught in the dry brush during the clash. "Stay with me," she whispered, though she doubted he could hear her anymore. Callum's eyes were half open, glassy, fixed on nothing. He had taken the blow meant for her, a blow from Julian Ashford's second, a warrior twice his size, and Callum had thrown himself into its path without hesitation, the way he always did, the way that made him more brother than Beta to her. Footsteps approached from the tree line, unhurried, deliberate. Elena did not need to look up to know who it was. She could feel it in the way the air changed, the way even the wounded animals nearby went still. Julian Ashford stepped out from the shadows, flanked by two of his warriors, his expression unreadable, his eyes sweeping over the scene with the cold assessment of a man counting his winnings. "He will not survive the hour," Julian said, his voice flat, almost bored. "Not without help, and I do not give help freely." Elena rose to her feet, blood still on her hands, and faced him without flinching. Her own pack was scattered behind her, wounded, outnumbered. Having lost this border skirmish decisively, her father was somewhere farther back, pinned beneath a felled tree and unable to move, being tended by two others. There was no one left to negotiate but her. "Name your price," she said. Julian's gaze flickered toward Callum's still form, then back to her, and something shifted behind his eyes, something that was not quite triumph. "You may not like it." "I did not ask if I would like it. I asked what it costs." He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing whether she understood the size of what she was offering to buy. Then he turned and gestured for his warriors to bring Callum's stretcher, a silent order that meant, for now, they would not simply let the boy die where he lay. It was not mercy. It was a door left open, waiting to see if she would walk through it. "Come to my den by nightfall," Julian said. "Alone. I will tell you my price then, in front of witnesses, so there is no argument later about what was agreed." "Why not tell me now?" "Because you would refuse me now, in anger, with his blood still on your hands. I want you to choose this with a clear head. I want no one saying later that I forced you." He paused, and for just a moment, something almost like reluctance crossed his features before it vanished. "Trust me when I say, the price is not what you expect." Elena watched as his warriors lifted Callum carefully, more carefully than she had expected from enemies, and carried him toward the Ashford territory. Every instinct told her not to let him out of her sight, but she had no strength left to fight, and no right to refuse the only offer of help on the table. She turned back toward her own people, gathering the wounded, giving orders in a voice that shook only slightly, and began the long walk home to tell her father that they had lost more than land today. The Heart Den was quiet that evening, quiet in the way a house is quiet after a funeral, full of people trying not to make noise around a grief too large to name. Elena's father, Gideon, lay on a cot with his leg bound tightly, his face gray with pain and worse, with humiliation. He had led the pack for 11 years without losing so much as a single acre. Today he had lost land, warriors, and possibly his best Beta's life, all in one afternoon. "You will not go," he said, the moment Elena told him about Julian's summons. "Whatever he wants, we will find another way." "There is no other way, and you know it," Elena said. "Callum has an hour, maybe less, without proper care. Our healer cannot reach him. Julian's pack has him now. If I do not go, we lose him for nothing, and you know Julian will use that against us for years, will call us cowards who abandoned their own." Gideon's jaw tightened. He was proud, prouder than was good for him sometimes, and Elena knew that pride was arguing with him now, telling him that no daughter of his should walk alone into an enemy den. But beneath the pride was something else, something that had kept him alive as alpha for over a decade. He knew when a fight could not be won by force, and he knew, though it cost him to admit it, that his daughter was the strongest negotiator left standing. "If he touches you, he will not need to touch me to hurt me," Elena said quietly. "That is not how Julian works. Whatever this price is, it will not be simple." She left before he could argue further. taking only a light cloak against the cold, and no weapons, because weapons would only give Julian's warriors an excuse. The walk to the border was long enough for her mind to spin through every possibility: a hostage exchange, a demand for land, a public apology from her father. None of it felt right. Julian had looked at her with something too careful, too deliberate for this to be a simple transaction of territory or coin. When she crossed into Ashford land, the change was immediate. Where her own pack's territory was open meadow and scattered farms, the Ashford den was carved into a hillside, torches lit along a winding path, the scent of pine smoke thick in the air. Warriors watched her pass without a word, their eyes following her the way one watches something unfamiliar and possibly dangerous. She kept her chin level and her pace steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs the entire way. Julian was waiting for her in a wide stone chamber, the walls lined with old trophies of past battles, antlers and blades, and a single, faded banner she did not recognize. He stood near a low fire, his arms crossed, and behind him, laid out on a bed of furs near the wall, was Callum, alive, bandaged properly, color returning slowly to his face, chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was ragged but steady. Relief hit Elena so hard her knees nearly buckled. "You kept your word." "I always keep my word," Julian said. "It is one of the few things I have left that means anything." There were others in the room, half a dozen Ashford warriors standing along the walls, silent witnesses as promised. Elena felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of an audience gathered for something more than a simple exchange of terms. "Tell me the price," she said. Julian was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice had lost its earlier flatness, replaced by something rawer, something that sounded almost like old grief, finally given permission to surface. "My brother died 8 months ago, at the hands of your pack. You may not remember him. Not everyone does, since he was gentle, and gentleness does not survive long in a place like this. His name was Adrian." Elena's stomach dropped. She did remember, vaguely, a skirmish, long before her time as her father's second, a young Ashford warrior, killed in a clash near the river. She had never known his name until now. "I did not kill him," she said carefully. "I know that. But your pack did, and someone in your pack owes a debt that has never been paid. I have decided how it will be paid." Julian walked to a wooden chest against the far wall, opened it, and lifted out a collar, simple leather, worn at the edges, a single silver ring at its center, that still gleamed despite its age. This was his. He wore it the day he died. It has hung in this room since, untouched, because none of us could bear to look at it, let alone wear it. He held it out, not toward Callum, not toward anyone else in the room, but toward Elena. "You will wear this," Julian said, willingly, "before every warrior gathered here, as a mark that your pack acknowledges the debt owed for his life. You will wear it for as long as I decide is fitting. In return, your beta lives, and this territory dispute ends tonight, with no further claims on Heartland." He paused, watching her face for a reaction he seemed almost afraid to see. "That is the price. Not blood. Not land. A collar, and your pride, worn openly, so that everyone who sees it understands what your pack cost mine." The room seemed to tilt slightly around her. She had expected land, coin, even a demand for her father's resignation as alpha. She had not expected this, a symbol so old and so loaded with meaning that even the warriors along the walls shifted uncomfortably at the sight of it in Julian's hand. A collar was not simply jewelry among their kind. It was a mark of ownership, of submission, of belonging to another. To wear a dead man's collar, publicly, willingly, was to place herself beneath his memory, beneath his family's grief, in front of witnesses who would carry the story back to both packs before the sun rose again. She looked past Julian to where Callum lay breathing, alive because of a decision she had not yet made. She thought of her father, wounded and proud, who would rather lose the argument forever than see his daughter wear the mark of an enemy's dead. She thought of the years of quiet resentment this single choice might buy her pack, the whispers that would follow her wherever she walked from this night forward. And then she thought of Callum's hand gripping hers as he shoved her out of the blade's path, the same instinct that had guided him since they were children, training together in the same yard, learning to fight side by side before either of them understood what loyalty would eventually cost. "Give it to me," she said. A murmur moved through the warriors along the walls, quiet, startled. Julian's own composure cracked for just a moment, surprise flickering across his face before he mastered it again. He had expected an argument. He had expected, perhaps, to have to threaten her further, to remind her of the alternative. He had not expected her to simply agree. "You understand what this means," he said quietly, almost as though giving her one last chance to reconsider. "Once it is done, it cannot be undone with words. Everyone in this room will carry what they witnessed tonight, and so will you." "I understand," Elena said, though in truth she understood only the shape of the cost, not its full weight. That would come later, in the days and weeks ahead, in ways she could not yet imagine. For now, all she understood was that Callum's chest was still rising and falling, and that was enough. She stepped forward and knelt, not because he demanded it, but because she knew the ritual required it, and because some stubborn part of her wanted to control at least the manner of her own surrender. Julian moved closer, the collar held between careful hands, and for a moment their eyes met, and she saw in his face not the triumph she expected, but something closer to sorrow, the look of a man forcing himself through a ceremony he had built out of grief rather than cruelty. "For Adrian," he said quietly, so quietly that only she could hear it, and fastened the collar around her neck. The leather was cool against her skin, worn smooth by years of another person's life, and the silver ring settled just beneath her collarbone, with a small, final click. The room erupted, not into cheers but into a low murmur of shock and something almost like awe, as though the warriors gathered had witnessed something they would be telling stories about for years to come. Elena remained kneeling for a moment longer, feeling the unfamiliar weight against her throat, feeling the eyes of an entire enemy pack settle onto her like a physical pressure. Behind Julian, Callum stirred weakly on his bed of furs, his eyes fluttering open just enough to see her kneeling there, the collar catching the firelight. Confusion crossed his face, followed swiftly by horror, as understanding dawned. "Elena," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper, "what have you done?" She did not answer him. She could not yet, not with her throat tight and her mind still catching up to the reality of what she had just agreed to. She only rose to her feet, steadying herself, and turned to face the room full of strangers, who now, in some fashion she did not yet fully understand, considered themselves owed a piece of her. Julian watched her rise, and for just a moment, something passed between them that was neither triumph nor hatred, something neither of them could name yet, though it would grow heavier and more complicated with every day that followed. The debt was paid, the beta would live, but the price, Elena was beginning to realize, was only just beginning to reveal itself, and it would take far more than one night to understand everything it would cost her, and everything it might one day give her in return. Outside, the wind picked up through the pines, carrying the scent of smoke and pine sap down toward the valley, where her own pack waited, unaware that the daughter they had sent to negotiate had returned wearing the mark of a dead man's ownership, and that nothing between the two packs would ever be quite the same again. The story of Adrian Ashford began, as most tragedies do, with a choice that seemed small at the time. 8 months before Elena knelt in that stone chamber, the Ashford pack and the Hart pack had shared an uneasy border. Not friends, not enemies, simply two territories that happened to touch along a winding river. Adrian had been the younger of Julian's two brothers, gentle by nature, in a way that made the older warriors uneasy, more inclined toward healing than fighting, more likely to be found tending injured animals in the woods than sparring in the training yard. He had never wanted the alpha position, though as Julian's blood brother he stood close enough to the line of succession that some in the pack whispered he might one day be forced to take it, whether he wanted it or not. Adrian had spent his days differently than most, wandering the borderlands, gathering herbs, occasionally crossing into neutral territory where the two packs' lands blurred together near the river, territory that belonged to no one and everyone at once. It was there, in that blurred stretch of riverbank, that he had first encountered a Hart pack scout, a young warrior named Simon Vane, who had been assigned to patrol the border that season. Their meetings, at first accidental, became something closer to habit over the following weeks. Two young men from rival packs, neither particularly interested in the old feud between their families, finding an unlikely companionship in the space where their territories overlapped. What happened on the day Adrian died was never fully agreed upon by either pack. The official story, the one that both alphas at the time had settled on to avoid a full war, was simple: a border skirmish, tempers rising, a fight breaking out between patrols, and Adrian caught in the middle, killed by an unnamed heart warrior in the chaos. Julian had accepted this story because the alternative, that Adrian had been killed deliberately, in circumstances his own pack had never fully investigated, was too painful and too dangerous to pursue without risking outright war. But grief does not settle for official stories. Not really. Not in the quiet hours when a person lies awake replaying the last conversation they had with someone now gone. Julian had spent 8 months turning the story over in his mind, searching for details that did not fit, for a truth buried somewhere beneath the version everyone had agreed to believe. He had never voiced his doubts publicly. He had simply waited, patient in the way only grief can make a person patient, for an opportunity to draw the truth closer without breaking the fragile peace that existed between the two packs. The collar had been Adrian's from the day he came of age, a simple mark given to every Ashford child when they turned 16, worn not as ownership but as belonging, a tradition unique to their pack that outsiders rarely understood. When Adrian died, the collar had been returned to the den, and Julian had kept it locked away, unable to bear looking at it, unable to bear giving it away, until the day Elena Hart knelt before him and gave him, however unintentionally, a reason to bring it back into the light. He had told himself, in the days leading up to the border skirmish that injured Callum, that the collar ceremony was about justice, about making the Hart pack understand the weight of what they had cost him. But standing in that stone chamber, watching Elena kneel with a steadiness that surprised him, he had felt something crack open inside himself, that he had kept carefully sealed for 8 months. It was not justice he wanted, it was answers. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a suspicion was forming that the answers he sought might not lie with the Hart pack at all, but with someone far closer to home, someone who had been present the day Adrian died and had never fully explained why. Simon Vane stood at the edge of the gathered crowd that night, watching Elena rise from her knees with the collar fastened around her throat, and his face, for anyone paying close enough attention, had gone the color of old ash. No one noticed. Everyone's eyes were on Elena, on Julian, on the ceremony unfolding at the center of the room. Simon slipped quietly toward the back of the chamber and out into the cold night air, his hands trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. He had told himself, for 8 months, that the story everyone believed was close enough to true, that the details did not matter. A skirmish, a death in chaos. No one's fault exactly, or everyone's fault equally, which amounted to the same thing in the end. He had not been the one to strike the blow that killed Adrian, not directly, but he had been there, closer than anyone in either pack knew, and the memory of that day sat in his chest like a stone he could never quite set down. Watching the collar settle around Elena's throat, watching Julian's carefully controlled grief play out in front of an audience, Simon understood with sudden, sickening clarity that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something that would not stop until the truth surfaced, one way or another, and he was no longer certain he had the strength to keep it buried much longer. Behind him, in the stone chamber, Elena stood beneath the weight of a collar she did not yet understand, surrounded by a pack of strangers, who now saw her as something between a hostage and a symbol, while somewhere farther back in the shadows, Callum watched her with heartbreak plain on his face, too weak to rise, too weak to protest, able only to whisper her name into a room that had already moved past him toward whatever came next. The night stretched on, torches burning low, until Julian finally gave the order for Elena to be escorted, under guard, to a chamber where she could rest until morning. She walked without resistance, the collar heavy and strange against her skin, her mind circling endlessly around the same unanswered question. What exactly had she agreed to, and how long would it take before she understood the true shape of the debt she now carried? Grace crossed the packs that night in the shape of a single, unresolved question, and neither Elena nor Julian nor Simon, watching from the shadows, knew yet how far its answer would eventually reach, or how much it would cost each of them before the truth finally came to light. Morning came slowly over the Ashford den, gray light filtering through narrow windows cut into the hillside stone. Elena woke stiff and disoriented, her hand rising instinctively to her throat before she remembered why the leather felt foreign against her skin. For one merciful moment, half asleep, she had forgotten. Then memory returned in full, and with it, the cold understanding that yesterday had not been a dream she could simply shake off. A young woman entered without knocking, carrying a tray of bread and water, her eyes flicking to the collar with poorly hidden curiosity, before she set the tray down and retreated just as quickly. Elena did not eat. Her stomach was tied in knots too tight for food, and her thoughts kept circling back to Callum, to whether he had survived the night, to whether her father had learned yet what she had done. She did not have to wait long for answers. Within the hour, Julian himself appeared at her door, his expression carefully neutral, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he had slept as poorly as she had. "Your beta is stable," he said, before she could ask. "Our healer says he will recover, though it will take weeks, not days. He is asking for you." Relief loosened something in her chest, and she rose immediately. "Take me to him." Julian did not move. "There are conditions to consider first. The collar is not simply a piece of leather you wear and forget. There are expectations that come with it, ways it must be honored while you remain within these lands." "What expectations?" "You will not remove it without my permission. You will not speak of it as though it were forced upon you, since that was never true, not in the eyes of anyone who witnessed the ceremony. And you will remain within Ashford territory until I judge the debt sufficiently honored." He paused, watching her reaction carefully. "I understand this is not what you expected when you agreed." "I did not expect any of this," Elena said, her voice tighter than she intended. "I agreed to spare Callum's life. I did not agree to become a prisoner in your den." "You are not a prisoner." Julian's voice sharpened slightly, the first real edge she had heard from him since the ceremony. "A prisoner is kept in chains, watched every moment, denied freedom of movement within these walls. You may walk where you please within Ashford land. You may speak with whomever you choose. The only thing asked of you is the collar itself, and the acknowledgement it represents." That sounds like a very generous description of captivity. Something flickered across his face, not quite amusement, not quite frustration. "Perhaps, but it is the arrangement, and you agreed to it with your own words, in front of witnesses who will hold both of us to it. If you wish to argue the terms, I suggest you do so before more of my pack hears of any change of heart. Word travels quickly here." Elena said nothing for a long moment, weighing her options, though in truth she had few. To argue now would only confirm every suspicion the Ashford pack might harbor about the sincerity of her agreement, and any hint of bad faith could easily undo the fragile truce her sacrifice had purchased. She swallowed her pride, as she had done the night before, and nodded. "Take me to Callum," she said again. "Please." This time, Julian led her through a series of narrow stone corridors, past warriors who watched her pass, with expressions ranging from open curiosity to poorly concealed distrust. The collar seemed to draw every eye, a visible mark that separated her from the rest of the den, even as it was meant to bind her to it. She kept her chin level, refusing to let the stairs unsettle her, though the effort of it left her tired by the time they reached the small chamber where Callum was recovering. He was awake when she entered, propped up against a stack of furs, his color much improved from the night before, though pain still lined his face with every breath. His eyes found the collar immediately, and his expression crumpled with something between grief and frustration. "Tell me you did not agree to this," he said, his voice hoarse, but steady enough to carry real feeling. "I did." Elena crossed the room and knelt beside him, taking his hand in hers, ignoring the way Julian lingered near the doorway, watching. "You would have died otherwise, Callum. There was no other choice on the table. There is always another choice. You could have let me go. I would have accepted that over this." He gestured weakly toward the collar, his jaw tight. "Do you understand what this means for you, for your standing in the pack?" "Your father will. My father will understand," Elena said, though she was not entirely certain of that herself. "What matters now is that you live. Everything else can be sorted out later." Callum shook his head slowly, his eyes glistening with a mixture of exhaustion and something that looked uncomfortably close to guilt. "I threw myself in front of that blade because I could not bear to watch you get hurt. And now you have hurt yourself anyway, in a way that will follow you for years, because of me. You did not ask for this. I chose it." Elena squeezed his hand. "Do not carry guilt for a decision that was mine alone to make." From the doorway, Julian shifted, and though he said nothing, Elena felt his attention sharpen, as though something in the exchange between her and Callum had caught his interest, in a way that went beyond simple oversight. She glanced toward him and found his expression unreadable. guarded in a way that made her wonder exactly how much of their conversation he intended to remember, and for what purpose. The following days settled into a strange rhythm. Elena was given a chamber of her own, small but not unkind, and permitted to move through much of the den under a loose form of supervision. She spent her mornings with Callum, tending small tasks around his recovery, and her afternoons largely alone, since few of the Ashford pack seemed willing to approach her directly, whether out of respect for the collar's meaning or simple unease at what it represented. It was on the third day that she first noticed Julian watching her from a distance during the pack's midday gathering, a shared meal taken in the wide central hall of the den. She had grown used to being observed by now, the collar making her an object of curiosity wherever she went, but Julian's attention felt different, more deliberate, less like scrutiny, and more like study. "You eat like someone who has spent a great deal of time worrying whether there will be enough food tomorrow," he said, settling onto the bench across from her without invitation, his tone almost conversational. Elena glanced up, startled by the observation. "That is an odd thing to notice." "I notice many things. It is part of what keeps a pack alive." He tore a piece of bread from the loaf between them, though he did not eat it, simply turned it over in his fingers, as though considering his next words carefully. "Your father runs a smaller pack than mine, with tighter resources. I imagine there were seasons when food was not guaranteed." There were. Elena did not elaborate further, uncomfortable with how easily he had read something so personal from so little. "Is there a reason you are asking about my childhood, or is this simply another way of reminding me how closely I am watched here?" "Perhaps both." Julian's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something close to one. "You interest me, Elena Hart. I expected someone who agreed to wear my brother's collar, out of desperation to spend her days here in quiet resentment, waiting for the moment she could leave, and never look back. Instead, you tend to your beta with genuine tenderness, and you eat your meals as though grateful for each one, and you have not once tried to argue your way out of the terms you agreed to, even when you clearly resent them." "Resenting a thing and refusing to honor it are different matters," Elena said. "I gave my word. I intend to keep it, whatever it costs me personally." Julian studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, softened almost imperceptibly, the careful mask he wore in front of his pack slipping just slightly to reveal something more thoughtful beneath it. "My brother believed the same thing, about keeping one's word. It was, I think, both his greatest strength and the thing that eventually cost him his life." It was the first time he had spoken of Adrian directly since the ceremony, and Elena sensed the weight behind the words, the careful restraint of a man who rarely allowed himself to speak of his grief so plainly. "Tell me about him," she said quietly, "if you are willing." For a moment, she thought he would refuse, would retreat back behind the composed distance he usually kept. But instead, he set the bread down, his eyes drifting toward the far wall as though looking through it, back toward some memory only he could see. "He was gentler than any of us expected. A child born into this pack to be," Julian said slowly. "While the rest of us trained for a fight from the time we could walk, Adrian preferred tending injured animals, learning which plants could ease a fever, which could stop bleeding. Our father despaired of him for years, certain he would never survive a life among warriors. But Adrian survived plenty of things people underestimated him for. He simply survived them differently than the rest of us." "How did he die?" Elena asked, though she already knew the official version, the one that had circulated through both packs for 8 months. Julian's expression closed slightly, the openness of a moment ago retreating behind something more guarded. "A border skirmish. Confusion. A blade that found him in the wrong place at the wrong time. That is the story everyone agreed upon, at the time, because the alternative risked a conflict neither pack could afford. You do not sound convinced by your own story." His eyes snapped back to hers, sharp with sudden intensity. "You are perceptive. Too perceptive, perhaps, for someone in your position." He rose from the bench, the brief warmth of the conversation evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. "I have said more than I intended. Enjoy your meal, Elena Hart." He left her sitting alone at the table, her mind spinning with the implications of what he had almost said, and had not. Something about Adrian's death did not sit right with Julian, something he had carried silently for 8 months, hidden even from his own pack, and now, without meaning to, Elena had stumbled close enough to that hidden doubt to make him retreat. That evening, as she walked the edge of the den under the loose watch of a young guard assigned to her, She noticed a figure lingering near the edge of the training yard, watching her with an intensity that made her uneasy. It was not one of the Ashford warriors she recognized. As she drew closer, she realized with a small shock that the man wore no pack markings, and something in his posture, tense and watchful, reminded her uncomfortably of a scout assessing unfamiliar territory. By the time she called out to him, he had already melted back into the shadows between the trees, gone before her guard could even turn to see what had caught her attention. She said nothing about it that night, uncertain what she had actually witnessed, but the memory of that watchful figure stayed with her long after she returned to her chamber. A small, uneasy thread pulling at the edges of a story she was only beginning to realize was far more complicated than a simple border skirmish gone wrong. Days passed, and the collar remained, a constant weight against her throat that she had slowly, reluctantly, begun to grow accustomed to. Callum's recovery continued steadily, his strength returning bit by bit, though the guilt in his eyes, whenever he looked at the collar, never fully faded. And Julian, despite his brief retreat after their conversation about Adrian, found reasons to seek her out again and again over the following week, drawn, it seemed, to a curiosity about her that neither of them fully understood yet, and that neither of them was quite ready to name. 2 weeks into her stay at the Ashford Den, Elena had learned the rhythms of a pack she once considered nothing more than an enemy silhouette on a map. She knew which warriors rose earliest to train, which children gathered near the kitchens hoping for scraps of honeyed bread, which elders sat in the shade each afternoon trading stories about battles fought decades earlier. The collar no longer felt quite so foreign against her throat, though it never stopped drawing eyes wherever she walked, a visible reminder to everyone, herself included, of the debt she carried. Callum was strong enough now to walk short distances unassisted, though the healer insisted he avoid anything that resembled real exertion for another few weeks. He spent most of his recovery watching Elena from across whatever room they shared, his expression a constant, quiet argument he never quite voiced aloud, though she could read every word of it in the set of his jaw. "You spend a great deal of time with him," Callum said one afternoon, as they sat together near the edge of the training yard, watching a group of young Ashford warriors spar under the direction of an older instructor. "With whom?" Elena asked, though she already knew. "Julian." Callum said the name carefully, as though testing its weight. "He seeks you out nearly every day now, I have noticed. He asks about my father's pack, about how we manage our territory, about small things that seem to interest him for reasons I cannot entirely explain," Elena said. "I do not think there is anything more to it than curiosity." Callum's expression suggested he did not fully believe that explanation, though he chose not to argue the point directly. "Be careful," he said instead. "Whatever his intentions, you are still wearing a symbol that marks you as beneath him, at least in the eyes of everyone here. Do not mistake conversation for equality." Elena said nothing, though his words settled uncomfortably in her chest, because some part of her had begun to wonder the same thing. Julian's attention had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, from the cold negotiator who had fastened the collar around her throat to something closer to genuine interest, though she could not name exactly what shape that interest was taking, or where it might eventually lead. That evening, she found herself walking the perimeter of the den alone, the guard assigned to her having grown lax enough in recent days to allow her these small solitary moments. The sky above the hillside was streaked with the last color of sunset, and the cool evening air carried the scent of wood smoke from the kitchens below. She had not intended to seek Julian out, but she found herself near the small clearing where she had first noticed him watching the stars some nights earlier. And there he was again, sitting alone on a flat stone, his gaze fixed upward. "You keep unusual hours for an alpha," she said, announcing her presence rather than startling him. Julian glanced over, and something in his expression eased slightly at the sight of her. "The hours belong to me. I find I think more clearly out here, away from the noise of the den." She settled onto the stone beside him, close enough for conversation, but careful to leave distance between them, uncertain of the boundaries that governed whatever this had become. "What do you think about, out here?" He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had lost the careful control he wore during the day. "My brother. Always my brother, if I am honest. I think about the questions I never asked him while he was alive, and the ones I cannot answer now that he is gone." "You mentioned once that you did not believe the official story of his death." Julian's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might retreat again, the way he had before. But instead, he exhaled slowly, as though releasing something he had held too long. There were details that never fit. Adrian was found near the river, in territory that belonged to neither pack fully, though closer to Heartland than ours. The wound that killed him was not the kind typically left by a warrior fighting in open combat. It was too precise, too deliberate, for a chaotic skirmish. You believe he was killed intentionally? I believe someone wanted his death to look like an accident of war, rather than what it actually was. Julian's hands clenched slightly against his knees. But I have no proof, only instinct. And instinct is not something either pack's counsel would accept as reason to reopen a wound that both sides worked hard to close 8 months ago. Elena considered this for a long moment, turning it over in her mind, alongside the memory of the strange, unmarked man she had glimpsed near the training yard on her third night in the den. She had told no one about that sighting, uncertain whether it meant anything at all, but now, hearing Julian's doubts laid bare, the memory took on new weight. I saw someone, she said slowly. A man near the edge of your territory, some nights ago. He wore no pack markings. He was watching me, and when I called out, he disappeared before my guard could see him. Julian turned to face her fully now, his attention sharp and immediate. Describe him. Tall, dark hair, dressed plainly, nothing that marked him as belonging to either pack. He moved like someone trained to avoid notice. Elena hesitated. I did not think much of it at the time. I assumed perhaps a scout from a neutral territory, passing through. There are no neutral scouts who linger near my den without purpose, Julian said, his voice low and tight. Show me exactly where you saw him. They walked together through the darkening woods, Julian's steps quick and purposeful, until they reached the edge of the training yard, where Elena had glimpsed the stranger. The area was empty now, nothing but shadows, and the distant sound of the wind moving through the pines. But Julian crouched near the tree line, studying the ground with the focused attention of someone who had spent years learning to read the smallest details a landscape could offer. Someone was here recently, he said after a moment, pointing to a set of faint impressions in the soft earth beneath the trees. More than once, by the look of it. These marks are not fresh, but they are not old either. Whoever this is, they have been watching the den for some time. A chill settled over Elena that had nothing to do with the evening air. You think this connects to Adrian? I do not know yet, but I intend to find out. Julian rose, brushing the dirt from his hands, his expression harder now than she had seen it since the night of the collaring ceremony. I want you to tell me immediately if you see this man again. Do not approach him. Do not call out. Simply find me, or find someone you trust among my warriors, and report it. You believe I am in danger. I believe there are things happening around the edges of both our packs that neither of us fully understands yet, and until I know more, I would rather be cautious than sorry. He looked at her then, and something in his gaze softened again, the hardness giving way to something gentler. You have already given more to this situation than anyone should reasonably ask. I do not intend to let anything else happen to you while you remain under my protection. The word protection settled strangely in her chest, at odds with the collar around her throat, at odds with everything she had understood their arrangement to be when she first knelt before him weeks earlier. She studied his face in the fading light, searching for some clearer understanding of what he meant by it, but found only the same careful, complicated warmth she had been noticing more and more in his expression, whenever their conversations turned personal. Why does this matter to you? She asked quietly. My safety, I mean. I am still, in the eyes of your pack, a symbol of a debt owed. Why concern yourself beyond that? Julian was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she wondered if he intended to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost reluctant, as though the words cost him something to admit. Because somewhere in these past weeks, you stopped being simply a debt to me, Elena Hart, and I am not entirely certain what to do with that. The confession hung between them in the cooling air, neither of them moving to close the distance it implied, both too uncertain of what such a step would mean, given everything that already stood between them. Elena felt her pulse quicken, a confusing mixture of caution and something warmer stirring beneath her ribs, and she was grateful when Julian, seeming to sense the same uncertainty, simply gestured for them to return to the den, rather than push the moment further. They walked back in silence, the mystery of the unmarked stranger settling alongside the unspoken tension between them, two threads winding together, into something Elena suspected would only grow more complicated in the days ahead. Behind them, deep in the woods, unseen by either, the same figure watched from a greater distance, patient and unhurried, waiting for an opportunity that had not yet presented itself, but that he was confident would come soon enough. News of the unmarked stranger spread quietly through the upper ranks of the Ashford pack over the following days, though Julian was careful to keep the details contained, unwilling to cause panic among warriors already stretched thin from the recent skirmish with the Hart pack. He assigned 2 additional guards to patrol the tree line near the training yard each night, and though no further sightings occurred immediately, the sense of unease lingered, a quiet undercurrent beneath the den's daily routines. Elena found herself drawn deeper into the rhythms of Ashford life than she had expected, no longer simply enduring her circumstances but genuinely curious about the pack she had once considered nothing more than a rival. She spent mornings with Callum, whose strength continued to return steadily, and afternoons increasingly in Julian's company, their conversations ranging from pack governance to old stories neither had shared with anyone outside their own walls. It was during one such afternoon, seated together near the kitchens, while a light rain fell outside, that Julian first mentioned Simon Vane's name, though not with any suspicion, simply as part of a larger conversation about the day of the border skirmish that had led to Callum's injury. "Your father's scout, the one who patrols the northern border most frequently," Julian said, tearing a piece of bread absently. "I have seen him at several of our shared council meetings over the years. Quiet, watchful. He rarely speaks unless directly addressed." Elena frowned slightly, trying to place the description. "Simon? Yes, he has patrolled that border for years, longer than I have been my father's second. Why do you ask?" "No particular reason. Something about him has always struck me as familiar, though I cannot place why." Julian's brow furrowed briefly, as though chasing a thought just out of reach, before he shook his head and let the matter drop. "It is likely nothing. Memory plays strange games sometimes, especially when grief is involved." Elena filed the comment away without much thought at the time, more interested in the warmth of the conversation itself than any hidden meaning behind it. But that night, alone in her chamber, the memory surfaced again, tangled together with the recollection of the unmarked stranger she had glimpsed near the training yard weeks earlier. Something about the description Julian had given, quiet, watchful, familiar in a way he could not quite place, sat uneasily alongside her own memory of a man who had vanished into the trees the moment she noticed him. She told herself the connection was likely nothing more than coincidence, 2 unrelated details her mind had stitched together out of anxiety rather than evidence. But sleep came slowly that night, her thoughts circling restlessly around questions she could not yet answer. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Ashford den, a rider from the Hart pack carrying a message from Gideon, requesting a formal meeting between the 2 alphas to discuss the terms of the ongoing arrangement, and, more urgently, Elena's continued absence from her own territory. Julian received the message with careful neutrality, though Elena could sense the tension it introduced into his expression as he read it over twice before setting it aside. "Your father wishes to see you," he said, handing her the letter. "He requests a meeting at the border, under truce, 3 days from now." Elena read the message quickly, her father's familiar handwriting carrying an urgency she recognized even through the formal language. He was worried, that much was clear, and likely furious as well, though he had restrained himself enough to frame the request diplomatically, rather than as a demand. "Will you allow it?" she asked, looking up at Julian. "The terms of our arrangement never prevented you from seeing your family. I simply required that you remain within my protection, and that the collar remain in place while you do." Julian's expression was harder to read than usual, something careful and guarded settling behind his eyes. "I will accompany you to the border myself, along with an appropriate escort. It would be unwise for either of us to travel there without sufficient protection, given recent events." "You believe the stranger I saw connects somehow to this meeting?" "I believe caution costs little, and carelessness costs a great deal. I would rather over-prepare than regret a decision made too casually." He studied her for a moment, something softer creeping into his expression despite the tension of the morning. "Are you ready to face your father, wearing what you wear now?" Elena's hand rose instinctively to the collar, and she considered the question honestly for the first time since the ceremony, weeks earlier. She had grown accustomed to its weight, had stopped noticing it during most of her days, but the thought of her father seeing it, of watching his reaction to the sight of his daughter marked in such a way, sent a fresh wave of uncertainty through her chest. "I do not know," she admitted, "but avoiding him will not make the conversation easier. Better to face it directly." The 3 days leading up to the border meeting passed with a strange mixture of anticipation and dread threading through Elena's every waking hour. Callum, upon hearing of the planned meeting, insisted on accompanying them, despite his healer's continued caution against exertion, arguing that Gideon would want to see with his own eyes that his beta had survived, and that no argument would convince him otherwise. Julian, somewhat to Elena's surprise, agreed readily, seeming to understand the importance of allowing Callum this small act of loyalty toward his alpha. On the morning of the meeting, Elena dressed carefully, choosing clothing that covered as much as practical, without drawing attention to the effort, though nothing could fully hide the collar itself, its silver ring catching the light no matter how she angled her cloak. Julian met her outside the den, dressed in formal attire befitting a diplomatic meeting between alphas, his expression composed but not entirely free of tension. "Whatever happens at this meeting," he said quietly, as they began the walk toward the border, "know that I will not allow your father to demand anything that would put you at risk. The terms we agreed upon remain the terms, regardless of what pressure he might attempt to apply." "My father is not a man easily pressured into anything," Elena said, "but he loves fiercely, and fierce love sometimes looks like anger from the outside." They reached the border clearing shortly before midday, the appointed meeting place marked by an ancient weathered boundary stone that had separated Hart and Ashford territory for generations. Gideon was already waiting, flanked by 2 of his most trusted warriors, his weight still favoring his uninjured leg, as he leaned slightly on a carved walking stick. His eyes found Elena immediately, and Elena watched, with a mixture of relief and dread, as his gaze traveled to the collar at her throat, his expression shifting through surprise, pain, and finally, a carefully controlled fury he directed not at her, but squarely toward Julian. "You did not mention in your letter that my daughter would arrive marked like property," Gideon said, his voice tight, though he kept it civil for the sake of the truce. "Your daughter agreed to the terms herself, before witnesses, in exchange for your beta's life," Julian replied evenly. "I did not force anything upon her that she did not choose freely." "Freely," Gideon repeated, bitterness sharpening the word. "There is little freedom in a choice made under the threat of watching someone you love die." Elena stepped forward before the exchange could escalate further, placing herself between the 2 men with the same steadiness she had shown the night of the ceremony. "Father, please, I made this choice, and I stand by it. Callum lives because of it. Shouting at Julian will not change what has already happened, and it will not help us move forward from here." Gideon's jaw worked silently for a moment, torn between the argument he clearly wanted to make and the truth of what his daughter had just said. Finally, his shoulders sagged slightly, the fight going out of him as exhaustion and relief took its place. "I only wanted to see for myself that you were unharmed," he said, his voice softer now. "The letters your escort sent home were not enough to ease my mind." "I am unharmed," Elena said gently, closing the remaining distance to embrace her father carefully, mindful of his injured leg. "Tired, and carrying more than I expected to carry, but unharmed." Behind her, Callum stepped forward to greet Gideon as well, and for a few minutes the tension of the meeting eased into something closer to the reunion it was meant to be, questions and reassurances passing between the Hart Pack members, while Julian stood at a respectful distance, watching with an expression Elena could not quite decipher. It was Gideon who eventually broached the more difficult subject, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Julian across the clearing. "There is something else I wish to discuss," he said. "Word has reached me of a stranger seen near your territory, unmarked, watching from the shadows. My scouts have reported similar sightings near our own border in recent days." Julian's expression sharpened immediately. "Your scouts have seen him as well?" "Twice, according to reports. Always at a distance, always gone before anyone could approach directly." Gideon's gaze flicked briefly toward Elena, then back to Julian. "I do not believe this is coincidence, and I do not believe our 2 packs are the only ones with reason to be concerned. Something is moving in the spaces between our territories, and I suspect it has been moving for longer than either of us realized." The clearing fell quiet for a moment, the weight of the revelation settling over everyone present. Elena thought again of the description Julian had given of Simon Vane, quiet, watchful, familiar in a way he could not place, and felt the uneasy threads of her earlier suspicion pulling tighter. though she still could not see the full shape of whatever pattern was forming around them. "Perhaps," Julian said slowly, "it is time our two packs shared information more openly than we have in the past, regardless of old rivalries. Whatever this threat is, it appears to concern us both equally." Gideon studied him for a long moment, weighing the offer against years of hard-earned wariness between their families. Finally he nodded, a small reluctant gesture of trust extended across a divide that had separated their packs for as long as either could remember. "Agreed. We will speak further, and soon. But for now, I trust you will keep my daughter safe, whatever else remains unresolved between us." "You have my word," Julian said, and though the words were simple, something in his tone carried a weight that made Elena's chest tighten with an emotion she was not yet ready to examine too closely. Standing there, at the border between two packs, whose futures, she was beginning to realize, might be more tangled together than anyone had yet understood. The weeks following the border meeting brought a cautious new cooperation between the Hart and Ashford packs, though old habits of suspicion did not vanish overnight. Messages passed more frequently between the two dens now, carried by trusted riders rather than left to chance encounters at the border, and Gideon, despite his lingering discomfort with the collar his daughter wore, began sharing what little his scouts had gathered about the unmarked stranger seen lurking near both territories. Elena remained at the Ashford den, the terms of her arrangement with Julian unchanged, though the atmosphere around her had shifted noticeably since the border meeting. Warriors who once eyed her with wary curiosity now offered small nods of acknowledgement when she passed, and even the kitchen staff had grown accustomed enough to her presence to include her in the easy, teasing banter that filled the mornings before the day's work began. It was Julian's growing habit of seeking her out that occupied most of her thoughts, though she was careful not to examine that habit too closely, uncertain what she would find if she did. Their conversations had deepened over the weeks, no longer confined to practical matters of pack governance or the mystery of the watching stranger, but wandering instead into quieter, more personal territory, shared memories, half-formed hopes, the kind of talk that built intimacy without either party quite noticing it happening. One evening, as autumn began to settle more firmly over the hillside, turning the surrounding forest into a wash of amber and rust, Julian found her sitting alone, near the same clearing where they had first spoken of Adrian weeks earlier. He settled beside her without asking permission, a habit that had become comfortable enough between them that neither felt the need for formality anymore. "You are quiet tonight," he observed, studying her profile in the fading light. "I was thinking about home," Elena admitted. "Not this home, though it has become more familiar than I expected. My father's den. The way the fields look this time of year, when the harvest is nearly finished and everyone gathers for the first bonfire of the season. Do you miss it terribly? Some days more than others." She turned to look at him, studying the careful concern in his expression. "Does that surprise you? No. I would think less of you if you did not miss your home." Julian's gaze drifted toward the darkening sky, and for a moment he seemed to be gathering his thoughts before speaking again. "I have been considering something, and I wanted to discuss it with you honestly, rather than simply deciding on your behalf, as I fear I did the night of the ceremony." Elena's pulse quickened slightly at the seriousness in his tone. "What is it?" "The collar," he said slowly. "I placed it upon you in grief and anger, seeking some form of justice for Adrian, that I now realize was never truly about you at all. You have honored the terms beyond anything I had a right to expect, and in doing so, you have shown me something about yourself that I did not anticipate when I made that demand." He paused, choosing his next words with obvious care. "I am beginning to think the debt has been paid many times over, and that continuing to hold you to its original terms serves no purpose beyond my own reluctance to admit that my grief led me somewhere I am no longer certain was fair." Elena's breath caught, uncertain how to respond to the vulnerability in his admission. "Are you saying you wish to release me from the collar?" "I am saying I no longer know what I wish, beyond wanting you to remain here not because you are bound by a debt, but because you choose to." Julian turned to face her fully now, his expression open in a way she had rarely seen from him. "I recognize how complicated that admission is, given everything that stands between us, but I find I can no longer pretend it is not true." The weight of his words settled over her, tangled together with everything she had felt building over the past weeks, the careful conversations, the quiet moments of shared understanding, the slow dissolution of the wariness that had once defined their every interaction. She had not allowed herself to name the feeling growing in her chest, uncertain whether it was safe to trust something that had begun under such strange and painful circumstances. But sitting here now, with Julian's honesty laid bare before her, she found she could no longer deny it either. "I do not know what I would choose, given the freedom to choose freely," she admitted quietly. "The collar has become tangled up with so many other things. My duty to Callum, my father's pride, the mystery we have not yet solved. I cannot say with certainty how much of what I feel is genuine, and how much is simply the natural result of circumstances that forced us together." "That is fair," Julian said, though something in his expression suggested the honesty cost him. "Perhaps it is enough, for now, that we are both willing to ask the question, rather than pretending it does not exist." They sat together in comfortable silence after that, the conversation settling into something gentler, less urgent, as the last light faded from the sky above them. It was in that quiet that a rustle in the nearby brush caught both their attention simultaneously, both trained enough to recognize the sound as something other than the wind. Julian rose immediately, positioning himself protectively between Elena and the source of the sound, his posture shifting into the alert readiness of a warrior, rather than the relaxed companion of moments before. "Show yourself," he called into the darkness, his voice carrying the authority of command. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, a figure emerged from the tree line, hands raised in a gesture of surrender, and Elena's breath caught, as she recognized him immediately, as the same unmarked stranger she had glimpsed weeks earlier near the training yard. "I mean no harm," the man said, his voice steady, despite the tension radiating from Julian's stance. "I have been trying to find the right moment to approach, without causing alarm. My name is Desmond. I served under Adrian, before his death." Julian's entire body went rigid at the mention of his brother's name. Adrian had no warriors serving directly under him. He held no formal position within the pack. "Not officially, no," Desmond said carefully, "but he was building something, quietly, in the months before he died. A network, gathering information about threats moving through the border territories that neither Hart nor Ashford leadership seemed aware of. I was one of several he recruited to help him." Elena felt a chill move through her at the implication. "What kind of threats?" Desmond's eyes flicked toward her, taking in the collar at her throat with a flash of something like surprise, before he composed himself again. "There has been a third party operating in the spaces between your two territories for well over a year now, Alpha. Small raids on outlying farms, livestock disappearing, occasionally a scout going missing without explanation. Both your packs have likely attributed these incidents to each other, feeding the rivalry between you, when in truth neither of you is responsible." "And Adrian discovered this," Julian said slowly, the pieces beginning to align in his expression. "He did. He was close to identifying the group responsible when he died." Desmond's jaw tightened. "I have always believed his death was connected to what he uncovered, not a random casualty of a border skirmish, but a deliberate act, meant to silence him, before he could expose what he had found." The clearing fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant call of some night bird settling into the trees. Elena's mind raced backward through everything Julian had told her about his doubts regarding Adrian's death, the precision of the wound that did not match a chaotic skirmish, the years of quiet suspicion he had never voiced publicly. And now here was confirmation, standing before them in the darkening clearing, that his instincts had been correct all along. "Why come forward now?" Julian asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Why wait 8 months, watching from the shadows, rather than approaching me directly with this information?" "Because I did not know who I could trust," Desmond said simply. Adrian believed someone close to leadership, in one pack or perhaps both, was either involved with this third party or being manipulated by them without realizing it. "I have spent these months trying to identify who that might be, before revealing myself and risking the same fate Adrian met." "And have you identified them?" Elena asked, her heart pounding, as she waited for his answer. Desmond's gaze shifted toward her again, something careful and calculating in his expression now. "I have a suspicion, though I am not yet certain enough to name names without proof. But I will tell you this. The person I suspect serves within the Hart Pack, close enough to leadership to move freely, without raising questions, and patient enough to have kept their true purpose hidden for well over a year." Elena's stomach dropped as the pieces began arranging themselves in her mind. Julian's earlier comment about Simon Vane's strange familiarity, the years he had spent patrolling the northern border with little oversight, the quiet, watchful nature that had never quite invited close scrutiny from anyone within her father's pack. She said nothing aloud, unwilling to speak an accusation she could not yet prove, but the suspicion settled heavily in her chest, a weight nearly as heavy as the collar she had worn faithfully for weeks now, and Julian, watching her expression shift, seemed to sense that some understanding had passed silently behind her eyes, though neither of them spoke it into the darkness surrounding them. Desmond agreed to remain near the Ashford den under careful guard, neither prisoner nor guest, while Julian and Elena worked to determine how much of his story could be trusted, and how much might be the product of grief, guesswork, or something more deliberately misleading. Julian assigned 2 of his most trusted warriors to keep watch over him through the following days, though he treated the man with a measure of respect that surprised Elena, given the gravity of what Desmond had suggested. "If he is telling the truth," Julian said, as they walked back toward the den that first night, "then everything we believed about my brother's death has been built on a foundation of lies, and someone within your father's pack has been playing both our families against each other for over a year, for reasons we still do not understand. And if he is lying," Elena said carefully, "then we risk tearing apart the fragile trust we have only just begun building with my father, based on nothing more than the word of a stranger with no proof." "Which is why we move carefully," Julian agreed. "No accusations, not yet. Only questions, asked quietly enough that whoever is responsible does not realize we are closing in on them." Over the following days, Elena found herself caught between 2 worlds more tightly than ever before, torn between loyalty to her father's pack and the growing certainty that something rotten had taken root within it. She thought constantly of Simon Vane, replaying every interaction she could remember over the years, searching for some detail she might have overlooked, some sign that should have raised suspicion earlier. It was Callum, finally strong enough to walk longer distances without exhaustion, who provided the piece that shifted everything into clearer focus. Elena had confided in him cautiously about Desmond's revelations, uncertain how much to share given the delicate nature of the investigation. But Callum's reaction told her immediately that her instincts about Simon had merit. "I have always found him strange," Callum admitted, as they sat together in the small garden behind the Ashford kitchens, the autumn sun warm, despite the cooling air. "Simon, I mean. He requests the Northern Patrol more often than any other route, has done for years, and rarely files detailed reports about what he encounters there. I assumed it was simply his nature, quiet and thorough rather than communicative. But now that you mention it, there were nights he returned late, well past when a normal patrol should have ended, with explanations that never quite added up." "Did you ever report this to my father?" Elena asked. Callum shook his head, guilt flickering across his expression. It seemed too small a thing to raise concern over, and Simon has served the pack loyally for years, by every visible measure. I did not want to accuse a fellow warrior of something without real evidence. "None of us did," Elena said gently, recognizing the same hesitation in herself that had likely kept others from questioning Simon's behavior over the years. "That is likely exactly what he counted on." Word came the following morning that Gideon wished for another meeting, this time to discuss the growing evidence of a third party operating along the border, information Julian had shared cautiously through their trusted riders, without yet revealing Desmond's full identity, or his specific suspicions about someone within the Heart Pack. Elena traveled to the meeting alongside Julian and a small escort, her mind heavy with the weight of what she now suspected but could not yet prove. Gideon met them at the same border clearing as before, though this time his expression carried less anger and more genuine concern, the earlier tension between him and Julian having eased somewhat in the weeks since their first meeting. "Your rider mentioned evidence of a third party responsible for the recent disappearances and raids," he said, once formal greetings had been exchanged. "I want to understand what you have learned." Julian explained carefully, choosing his words to avoid naming Desmond directly, or revealing the full scope of his suspicions, though he laid out enough of the pattern, the disappearances, the raids attributed wrongly to each pack, the possibility of a hidden network operating in the shadows, to make Gideon's expression grow increasingly troubled. "This aligns with reports I have received but never fully understood," Gideon admitted. "Livestock vanishing without explanation. A scout who never returned from a routine patrol, nearly a year ago now, whose disappearance we attributed at the time to an unfortunate encounter with wildlife. though no remains were ever found. He paused, something uneasy settling behind his eyes. If there is truly a third party responsible for these things, why would they work so hard to make our two packs suspect each other instead? Because a rivalry consumed with distrust is far easier to manipulate than two packs working together, Julian said. Whoever is responsible has likely profited from keeping us divided, whether through territory, resources, or simply the chaos such division creates. Gideon absorbed this in silence for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward Elena, taking in the collar she still wore, the visible symbol of a rivalry that suddenly seemed far less important, set against the larger threat now coming into focus. What do you need from me? To help uncover the truth? Elena stepped forward, before Julian could answer, her heart pounding, as she prepared to voice the suspicion she had carried since Desmond's revelation. Father, I need you to consider something carefully, without reacting immediately. There is reason to believe someone within our own pack has been involved with this third party, whether willingly or through manipulation, for well over a year. Gideon's expression darkened. Who do you suspect? Simon Vane, Elena said quietly. His frequent requests for the Northern Patrol, his vague reports, the nights he returned later than expected with explanations that never fully satisfied anyone who questioned them. Individually, these details mean little. Together, they form a pattern that troubles me deeply. For a long moment, Gideon said nothing, his jaw working, as he processed the accusation against a warrior who had served his pack faithfully, by all outward appearances, for years. This is a serious claim, Elena. Simon has never given me reason to doubt his loyalty. I know, Father, which is exactly why, if he is involved, he has been remarkably careful to avoid suspicion. Elena held his gaze steadily. I am not asking you to condemn him without proof. I am asking you to watch him closely, quietly, until we can determine the truth one way or another. Gideon's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of the accusation settling over him, alongside the earlier revelations about the third party's manipulation of both packs. I will watch him, he said finally, carefully, and without alerting him to our suspicions. If what you say proves true, it will cut deeply, Elena. Simon trained alongside warriors I consider close friends. His betrayal, if it is betrayal, will not be easily forgiven by this pack. The meeting concluded with plans for continued communication between the two packs, a fragile alliance built now not on old rivalry, but on a shared threat neither had fully understood until recent weeks. As Elena prepared to return to Ashford territory alongside Julian, her father pulled her aside for a private moment, his expression softening from the formal composure he had maintained throughout the meeting. You have grown into someone I barely recognized these past weeks, he said quietly, studying her face with something between pride and lingering worry. Stronger, perhaps, though I wish the circumstances that forged that strength had been kinder to you. I am still your daughter, Father, Elena said, embracing him carefully. Whatever else has changed. I know. Gideon glanced briefly toward Julian, who stood at a respectful distance, allowing them privacy for their farewell. And I see the way he watches you, Elena. I am not blind to it, whatever complications remain between our packs. Be careful with your heart, even as you remain careful with everything else. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain how to respond to her father's quiet observation, though she could not deny the truth beneath it. She said nothing, simply embraced him once more, before turning to rejoin Julian for the walk back toward Ashford territory, her mind now consumed with the delicate work ahead, watching Simon Vane from a distance, gathering proof before any accusation could be made openly, all while the mystery of the third party's true identity and purpose remained frustratingly out of reach, waiting somewhere in the shadows for its own moment to surface. The days that followed settled into a tense, watchful quiet, both packs moving carefully around the shared suspicion now hanging over them, careful not to alert Simon Vane that his movements had drawn attention. Gideon, true to his word, began quietly tracking Simon's patrol requests and the timing of his reports, comparing them against the pattern of disappearances and raids that had plagued the border territories for over a year. Elena remained at the Ashford den, though her thoughts were divided constantly between the investigation unfolding at her father's territory and the deepening connection growing between herself and Julian with each passing day. Desmond, still held under careful watch, proved a valuable source of information once he grew confident enough to trust that neither Alpha intended him harm, sharing details about Adrian's final months that painted a fuller picture of the young man's quiet, determined efforts to uncover the truth before his death. He kept records, Desmond told them one afternoon, as they sat together in a private chamber within the Ashford den, Julian's expression tightening with each new detail about his brother's secret work. Notes on the pattern of disappearances, maps marking where livestock had gone missing, dates that seemed significant, though I never fully understood his reasoning behind them. He kept them hidden, somewhere along the border, in a location he never fully shared, even with those of us helping him. "Do you have any idea where he might have hidden such records?" Julian asked, leaning forward with obvious urgency. Desmond hesitated. He mentioned once, in passing, a place from his childhood, somewhere he used to go to escape the pressures of pack life. A hollow tree, or perhaps a cave, near the river where he died. I never pressed him for specifics, and now I regret that more than I can express. Elena felt a spark of hope at this revelation. If we could find those records, we would have real proof, something beyond suspicion and pattern recognition. The river territory is vast, and much of it overlaps uncomfortably between our two packs' claims, Julian said, his mind clearly already working through the logistics of such a search. It would require cooperation between both packs to search thoroughly, and time we may not have if Simon suspects we are closing in on him. The search began the following week, small teams from both packs working alongside each other along the riverbank, covering ground methodically while trying to maintain enough discretion that word would not easily reach Simon, or whoever he might be working with. Elena joined one such team personally, walking familiar stretches of territory from her childhood, alongside two Ashford warriors who had grown, over the recent weeks, from wary strangers into something closer to trusted companions. It was on the fourth day of searching that Elena herself stumbled upon what they had been seeking, a hollow beneath the roots of an ancient willow tree, half hidden by overgrown brush, exactly the kind of quiet, secluded spot a gentle young man like Adrian might have chosen as his private refuge. Inside, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to protect against the damp, she found a leather journal filled with careful notes, maps marked with small symbols she did not immediately understand, and a list of dates spanning nearly a year before Adrian's death. She sent word immediately to Julian, who arrived within the hour, his expression a complicated mixture of grief and determination, as he took the journal into his hands for the first time, recognizing his brother's careful handwriting, filling page after page with the patient work of someone determined to protect two packs that had never fully appreciated the quiet courage he carried. "He was so close," Julian murmured, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. "Look here, dates matching nearly every disappearance and raid over the past year. And here, a pattern emerging around the timing of Simon's patrol requests, marked with a small symbol that appears again and again." Elena leaned closer, studying the pages alongside him. He suspected Simon specifically, even then. "It appears so." Julian's jaw tightened as he turned to a later page, one dated only days before Adrian's death. "Here, listen to this. He writes that he has arranged to meet someone near the river, someone he believes can confirm his suspicions about a hidden network operating through both territories, using Simon as an unwitting, or perhaps willing conduit for information and resources. Does he name this person he planned to meet?" Julian's expression darkened further as he read the final entry aloud, his voice growing tight with barely contained emotion. "He does not name them directly, only refers to them as someone with access to both packs' councils, someone positioned to move freely between Hart and Ashford territory, without raising suspicion." He looked up at Elena, something cold settling behind his eyes. This person, whoever they are, likely knew Adrian was closing in on the truth, and arranged the meeting that led directly to his death. The weight of the discovery settled heavily over both of them. The confirmation of everything Julian had suspected for 8 months, now laid bare in his brother's own careful handwriting. Elena thought immediately of Simon, wondering whether he had been the one to meet Adrian that final day, or whether he too had been manipulated by someone even further removed from suspicion, someone with access to both packs' inner circles, that neither Elena nor Julian had yet considered. They returned to the Ashford den, with the journal carefully secured, and Julian immediately sent word to Gideon, requesting an urgent meeting, the discovery too significant to delay any longer, despite the risk of alerting Simon to how close the investigation had drawn. The meeting was arranged for the following evening, this time held within the relative security of the Ashford den itself, rather than the exposed border clearing. Gideon traveling with a small, trusted escort that did not include Simon among its number. When Gideon arrived and reviewed the journal's contents himself, his expression shifted through disbelief, anger, and finally a grim, determined resolve that Elena recognized as the same steel that had kept him alive as Alpha for over a decade. "I have been watching Simon closely these past weeks, as promised," he said, once he had absorbed the full weight of what the journal revealed. "There have been discrepancies in his reports, subtle, but consistent. Patrol times that do not fully account for his absences, encounters he describes vaguely when pressed for detail. I had not yet gathered enough to confront him directly, but this," he gestured toward the journal, "this changes everything. We can no longer afford to wait and watch quietly." Gideon considered this carefully, his gaze moving between Julian and Elena, weighing the delicate balance between swift justice and careful strategy. "I propose we set a trap, using information only Simon would recognize as significant, and see whether he moves to protect himself, or to warn whoever he has been working with. If there is truly a larger network involved, as Adrian's journal suggests, capturing Simon alone will accomplish little if the true architect of this scheme remains hidden and free to continue their work elsewhere." Elena felt a chill move through her at the plan's implications, the danger inherent in deliberately drawing out someone capable of orchestrating a death disguised as an accident of war. "It will be dangerous," she said quietly, "for whoever carries out this trap." "It will," Gideon agreed, "which is why I intend to lead it myself, alongside those I trust most completely." "Then you will not lead it alone," Julian said firmly. "Whatever remains unresolved between our packs, this threat now belongs to both of us, equally. I will not stand aside while you risk yourself uncovering a truth that has cost my family so much already." Gideon studied him for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, the last vestiges of old rivalry giving way to genuine respect for the man who had once been nothing more than an enemy silhouette across a contested border. "Very well," he said finally. "Then let us plan this together, carefully, and put an end to whatever shadow has been feeding on the divide between our packs for far too long." As the two alphas bent over the journal together, working through the details of a plan that would finally bring Adrian's careful, quiet courage to its full purpose, Elena stood slightly apart, watching the fragile alliance she had helped forge take on new strength in the face of shared purpose. The collar at her throat felt different now than it had weeks earlier, no longer simply a mark of debt and submission, but something closer to a symbol of everything that had grown from that painful beginning, a bridge between two packs finally learning to see each other clearly, standing together against a threat that had worked so patiently to keep them apart. The plan they devised was careful and deliberate, built around a single piece of false information designed to draw Simon into revealing himself. Gideon would announce, quietly enough that only a handful of trusted individuals within the Heart Pack would hear, that new evidence had surfaced regarding the disappearances along the border, evidence supposedly recovered from a hidden location near the river, evidence that named names and detailed the full scope of the network responsible. The information would reach Simon through channels that appeared natural, a conversation overheard, a report filed carelessly within his sight, nothing that would suggest deliberate manipulation. "If he is as deeply involved as we suspect," Gideon explained, as the three of them finalized the details late into the evening, "he will feel compelled to act, either to retrieve this supposed evidence before anyone else can review it, or to warn whoever he answers to that their operation has been exposed. Either action will reveal more than he intends." Elena felt the weight of the coming days pressing against her chest, uncertain what shape the confrontation would take, though she understood the necessity of finally bringing the truth into the light after so many months of careful, patient investigation. Callum, informed of the plan despite his continued recovery, insisted on being present when the trap finally closed, arguing that his position as Beta gave him every right to stand alongside his Alpha during such a critical moment. "You have already sacrificed enough recovering from your injury," Elena said, trying to dissuade him gently. "There is no need to place yourself in further danger before you have fully healed." "I sacrificed nothing that you did not sacrifice more of," Callum replied, his tone firm despite the lingering weakness in his voice. "I will not sit safely aside while the people who orchestrated the chaos that nearly cost me my life are finally brought to account. Let me stand with you, Elena, as I always have." She relented, recognizing the same stubborn loyalty in him that had first drawn her to trust him as her beta years earlier. And together, they returned to Heart territory 2 days later, joining her father's chosen circle of trusted warriors, as the trap began to unfold according to plan. The false information reached Simon exactly as intended, planted through a carefully staged conversation between two of Gideon's most trusted advisors, deliberately held within earshot of the northern patrol route where Simon was known to linger during his reporting hours. Elena, watching from a concealed position alongside her father and two additional warriors, felt her pulse quicken as she observed Simon's reaction from a distance. The subtle tension that entered his posture, the careful way he lingered near the conversation without appearing to eavesdrop directly. That evening, exactly as Gideon had predicted, Simon requested an unscheduled patrol along the river route, citing a need to verify reports of unusual activity near the border. Gideon granted the request without hesitation, careful to maintain the appearance of routine trust, while simultaneously dispatching a small, discreet team to follow Simon's movements from a careful distance. Elena joined this team herself, moving quietly through the familiar terrain of her childhood, alongside two Ashford warriors Julian had sent to assist, a gesture of continued cooperation between the two packs that would have seemed impossible only months earlier. They tracked Simon's movements through the darkening forest, careful to remain hidden among the trees, until he reached a small clearing near the river, where another figure was already waiting, cloaked and hooded against the evening chill. "You said the evidence was recovered," Simon said, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet clearing, tight with obvious anxiety. "If Gideon has truly found Adrian's records, we are finished. Everything we have built collapses the moment he understands the full scope of what has been happening." The hooded figure's response was calm, almost dismissive, carrying an authority that made Elena's skin prickle with unease, even from her hidden position. "You worry too easily, Simon. Even if he has found scattered notes, proving anything conclusively will take time we can use to our advantage. Continue as instructed. Report anything further you learn immediately. And if they suspect me directly, I have grown careless these past months, distracted by other concerns. I cannot guarantee my position remains as secure as it once was. Then perhaps it is time to consider whether your usefulness has run its course," the hooded figure said, something colder entering their tone now. "We will discuss your continued role once I better understand how close their investigation has truly come. For now, return to your duties and give them no further reason for suspicion." Elena exchanged a tense glance with the warriors beside her, all of them straining to catch a clearer glimpse of the hooded figure's face, though the darkness and the deliberate concealment made identification impossible from their current position. As the conversation continued, weaving through details about shipments, payments, and territories Elena did not fully understand, she realized with growing dread that whatever network Adrian had uncovered 8 months earlier extended far beyond a single corrupt scout, reaching into structures and resources that suggested planning and patience spanning years rather than months. It was Callum, positioned slightly closer to the clearing than the rest of their group, who finally caught the fatal misstep that brought the confrontation to its head. Shifting his weight to gain a better vantage point, he dislodged a loose stone that clattered audibly against the rocks below, the sound sharp and unmistakable in the quiet evening air. Both figures in the clearing went still immediately, and Elena watched with her heart pounding as Simon's hand moved instinctively toward the blade at his hip, his eyes scanning the tree line with sudden, sharp suspicion. "Someone is here," he said quietly to his companion. The hooded figure did not hesitate, turning immediately and disappearing into the darker shadows along the riverbank with practiced speed, leaving Simon alone in the clearing as Gideon's warriors, unable to maintain concealment any longer, emerged from the trees with weapons drawn but not raised, a clear demonstration that they intended capture rather than confrontation, if Simon would allow it. "It is over, Simon," Gideon said, stepping forward from among the trees, his voice heavy with a grief that went beyond simple anger. The pain of watching a warrior he had once trusted, revealed as a traitor to everything the pack stood for. "We have heard enough to understand the truth. There is no use continuing to deny it." Simon's shoulders sagged, the fight visibly draining out of him as he recognized the impossibility of his position, surrounded and exposed with nowhere left to run. "You do not understand what you are dealing with," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weariness that suggested years of carrying a secret too heavy to bear alone. The person you just watched vanish into those shadows is only a small piece of something much larger than either of our packs can fully comprehend. Then you will help us understand it, Gideon said firmly. Willingly, or otherwise. But you will not simply vanish into the shadows as your companion just did. As Gideon's warriors moved to secure Simon, Elena felt a complicated mixture of relief and unease settle over her. The confirmation of everything they had suspected finally laid bare, yet accompanied by the unsettling realization that the true architect of this scheme remained free, disappearing into the night before anyone could confirm their identity. Whatever victory this moment represented, it was clearly only the beginning of a much larger reckoning still waiting to unfold, and as she looked toward Callum, relief evident on his face at finally seeing justice begin to take shape, she understood that the road ahead would demand more from all of them, before the full truth could finally come to light. Simon Vane's interrogation, conducted carefully over the following days by Gideon himself, alongside a small circle of trusted advisors, revealed a story more complicated and more tragic than anyone had anticipated. He had not begun as a willing traitor, he explained, his voice hollow with the exhaustion of finally releasing a burden carried alone for far too long, but had instead been drawn into the network gradually, over years, through debts and pressures that had seemed manageable at first, and had grown, slowly and inexorably, into something he could not escape without risking everything he cared about. They approached me first through coin, he admitted, sitting across from Gideon in a private chamber within the Heart Den, his hands bound loosely, more symbolic than truly restrictive, given how thoroughly his will to resist had already broken. A debt from my younger years, gambled away foolishly before I understood the weight of such things. They offered to clear it, in exchange for small favors at first, reports on patrol schedules, minor details that seemed harmless enough at the time. And it grew from there, Gideon said. Not a question, but a statement of understanding. It always grows from there. Simon's eyes were distant, focused on some point in the past he clearly wished he could unmake. By the time I understood the true scope of what I had become entangled in, extracting myself felt impossible. They made it clear, without ever stating it directly, that my family would suffer if I attempted to withdraw or expose them. Elena, standing quietly near the back of the chamber alongside Julian, felt a complicated wash of sympathy, mixed with lingering anger at the revelation. The betrayal remained real. The consequences of Simon's choices had cost Adrian his life, and nearly cost Callum his as well. Yet the picture emerging now was not simply one of malice, but of a man trapped by circumstances that had slowly consumed his ability to choose differently. "Tell us about Adrian," Julian said, stepping forward for the first time since the interrogation began, his voice carrying a tightly controlled emotion that Elena recognized from their earlier conversations about his brother. Simon's expression crumpled slightly, genuine grief crossing his features for the first time. He discovered the pattern before I fully understood he was looking. We had spoken occasionally, near the river, simple conversations between two young men who found the rivalry between our packs tiresome and unnecessary. I did not realize, until it was too late, that those conversations had given him enough information to begin piecing together the truth. "You met him that final day," Julian said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did." Simon's eyes closed briefly, as though the memory itself caused physical pain. He asked me directly whether I had noticed the pattern of disappearances, whether I believed something beyond simple rivalry explained them. I panicked, and I reported the conversation to my contact, believing at the time that I was simply protecting myself from suspicion. I did not know, I swear to you, Alpha, I did not know they intended to silence him permanently. I believed they only meant to frighten him into silence. Julian's jaw clenched so tightly that Elena could see the muscle working beneath his skin. Years of carefully suppressed grief, finally finding a concrete target for the anger that had simmered beneath his composure since the night of Elena's ceremony. "Who gave the order?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Who is the person you met at the river 2 nights ago?" "I do not know their true name," Simon said, and something in his exhausted honesty made Elena believe him despite herself. "They have always operated through intermediaries, through hooded meetings and coded messages, careful never to reveal more than necessary. I know only that they command resources and influence far beyond what either of our packs alone could muster, and that others like me exist within territories beyond our own, each of us compromised in similar ways. each of us too afraid to speak until now. The implications of this settled heavily over the room, the understanding that whatever network had claimed Adrian's life, and nearly claimed Callum's as well, extended far beyond the borders of Hart and Ashford territory, into a scope neither pack could fully comprehend or combat alone. Gideon exchanged a grave look with Julian, the same silent understanding passing between them that had brought their two packs together in cooperation these past weeks. "We will need help beyond our own resources to fully unravel this," Gideon said finally. "This is larger than a border dispute or a personal grief, however much both those things matter. This threatens every pack whose territory borders ours, and likely many we have never considered. Then we begin building alliances beyond our own two packs," Julian said, his earlier fury settling into something more focused, more strategic. Carefully, and with proof rather than accusation, learning from the mistake that nearly tore Hart and Ashford apart, through suspicion planted by someone working in the shadows. As the immediate crisis of Simon's confession began to settle into the longer, more complicated work of building a wider response, Elena found herself drawn aside by her father later that evening, his expression carrying a weight of emotion he had kept carefully controlled throughout the difficult days of investigation and confrontation. "I owe you an apology," Gideon said quietly, once they were alone in his private chamber, the fire burning low against the evening chill. "When you agreed to wear that collar, I saw only humiliation, only a debt paid at the cost of your dignity. I did not understand, could not have understood, everything it would eventually reveal, or the strength it would take for you to carry it, as you have these past weeks. You do not need to apologize, Father," Elena said gently. "Your anger came from love. I never doubted that, even when it frustrated me. Perhaps, but love should not blind a father to his daughter's courage, and I fear mine nearly did." Gideon studied her carefully, something soft and proud settling into his weathered features. "Whatever happens next, whatever this larger threat eventually reveals, I want you to know that I am prouder of the woman you have become through these trials than I have words to properly express." Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, the accumulated weight of the past weeks finally finding release in this quiet, private moment with her father. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." Later that night, as she prepared to return to Ashford territory alongside Julian, Callum found her near the stables, his expression thoughtful, in a way that suggested he had been turning something over in his mind for some time now. "You will return to Julian's den," he said, not quite a question. "For now, yes. There is still much work ahead in uncovering the full scope of this threat, and my presence there has become useful to that effort." Elena studied his face carefully, sensing something unspoken beneath his words. "Does that trouble you?" Callum was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the darkening sky above them. "It troubled me greatly, in the beginning," he admitted finally. "Watching you kneel before him, watching that collar settle around your throat, I felt as though I had failed you by needing saving in the first place. But I have watched you these past weeks, Elena, watched the strength you have shown, and I understand now that what began as sacrifice has become something else entirely, something I have no right to stand between. Callum, let me finish," he said gently, a small, sad smile touching his lips. "I care for you deeply, as I always have, and perhaps once I hoped that care might grow into something more between us, but I see now what has grown instead, between you and Julian, and I would rather be your friend and trusted beta for the rest of my life than stand in the way of something that has clearly become real for both of you." Elena felt a complicated wave of gratitude and gentle sorrow at his words, the closing of one possibility, alongside the quiet blessing of another. "Thank you," she said softly, embracing him carefully, "for understanding, and for everything you have always been to me." "Always," he said simply, and in that single word, she heard the full measure of a loyalty that would outlast whatever changes came next. A friendship strong enough to weather even this quiet reshaping of what they had once imagined their futures might hold. Winter arrived slowly over the hillside, the first frost settling across the Ashford den's stone walls on a morning when Elena woke to find the world outside her window transformed into something quiet and glittering, the harsh edges of the past months softened, at least for a moment, by the beauty of the changing season. She had spent the weeks since Simon's confession working alongside Julian and her father, building the careful foundations of an alliance that now stretched beyond their two packs, into neighboring territories, each one drawn cautiously into the growing understanding of a threat that had operated unseen for far too long. Desmond had proven invaluable in these efforts. His knowledge of Adrian's careful research, combined with his own months of quiet observation, helping to identify patterns that connected disappearances and manipulations across a far wider stretch of territory than anyone had initially believed possible. The hooded figure from the riverside clearing remained unidentified, slipping through every careful trap they had attempted to set in the weeks since, though each failed attempt narrowed the possibilities further, bringing them closer, Elena believed, to a resolution that felt increasingly within reach. Simon remained under careful watch within the Heart Den, his punishment tempered by the genuine remorse he had shown and the valuable information he continued to provide, a complicated justice that Gideon had wrestled with extensively, before settling on a path that balanced accountability, with the recognition that Simon himself had been as much victim as perpetrator in the larger scheme that had consumed him. It was on the morning of the first true snowfall that Julian found Elena standing near the same clearing where they had shared so many quiet conversations over the past months, her breath visible in the cold air, her attention fixed on the delicate patterns the snow was tracing across the bare branches above them. "I have something I wish to discuss with you," he said, settling beside her with the easy familiarity that had grown between them since that first tense meeting in the stone chamber all those months ago. "That sounds serious," Elena said, though her tone carried more warmth than concern, accustomed by now to the weight Julian often carried into their private conversations. "It is, in its way." He turned to face her fully, and she saw in his expression a vulnerability he rarely allowed others to witness, reserved, she had come to understand, only for these quiet moments between them. "The debt is paid, Elena. Has been paid for months now, many times over. Through everything you have given to uncovering the truth about my brother, through the strength you have shown facing threats that had nothing to do with the original terms of our arrangement." Elena's hand rose instinctively to the collar, still resting familiar and warm against her throat after so many months of wearing it. "You wish to release me from it. I wish to give you the choice I should have given you from the very beginning," Julian said, reaching into his cloak to produce a small key, one she had never seen before, clearly crafted specifically for this moment. "This collar was forged with a lock, long ago, though I never told you, because I was not certain I was ready to offer you a true choice until now. You may remove it whenever you wish, Elena. I place no further conditions upon that choice." She stared at the key in his outstretched hand, understanding immediately the significance of what he was offering. Not simply freedom from an old debt, but the opportunity to choose, with full clarity and without any lingering obligation, whether she wished to remain bound to him at all, in any form. "And if I choose to remove it," she said quietly, "what happens then, to us? Then you return to your father's pack, with my deepest gratitude and respect, and whatever exists between us remains a chapter we both remember fondly, without regret." Julian's voice carried a careful steadiness that could not fully hide the vulnerability beneath it. "I will not pretend that outcome would not grieve me, but I would rather you leave freely than remain bound by anything less than your own genuine choice." Elena took the key from his hand, feeling its small, cold weight against her palm, and for a long moment she simply held it, considering everything the past months had brought her, the grief and the growth, the uncovering of a truth larger than either of their packs had imagined, the slow, careful building of trust between two people who had begun as adversaries and had become something far more complicated and far more precious in the time since. She thought of her father's pride in the woman she had become, of Callum's gentle blessing offered freely despite what it must have cost him, of the countless quiet moments with Julian that had taught her more about genuine partnership than she had ever expected to find, especially not beginning from a place of forced submission and grief. "I do not wish to remove it," she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion swelling in her chest. "Not because I am bound by any debt or obligation, but because somewhere in these months, this collar stopped representing what it once did, and became instead a symbol of everything we have built together, out of tragedy and stubbornness, and, eventually, something I am no longer afraid to call love." Julian's composure broke fully then, relief and joy washing across his features in a way she had rarely seen from the careful, controlled alpha she had first knelt before all those months ago. "Elena," he said softly, reaching for her hands, the key still resting between their joined palms. Are you certain? More certain than I have been of anything in a very long time, she said, smiling despite the tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. I love you, Julian Ashford, not despite everything that brought us together, but because of the strength and honesty we found within it. I love you as well, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide. I have for longer than I allowed myself to admit, even to myself, afraid of what it meant to fall in love with someone I had bound to me through grief rather than choice. They stood together in the falling snow, the collar still resting warm against her throat, no longer a mark of debt or submission, but something transformed entirely, through months of shared purpose and growing trust, into a symbol neither of them had anticipated, a reminder of how far they had traveled together, from that first tense night in the stone chamber, to this quiet, snow-covered clearing, where love had finally found room to grow. In the months that followed, the alliance between Hart and Ashford grew stronger still, extending outward to neighboring packs, as the search for the true architect behind the network that had claimed Adrian's life continued, patient and thorough, building toward a reckoning that both packs now faced together, rather than divided by old suspicions. Simon, having proven his genuine remorse through months of careful cooperation, was eventually granted a measure of trust once more, though he would carry the weight of his choices for the rest of his life, a quiet reminder to everyone of how easily fear and old debts could be turned into tools of manipulation by those patient enough to exploit them. Callum remained close to Elena always, his role as Beta evolving into something that bridged both packs now, a trusted voice in the growing alliance that had begun with such painful uncertainty and had blossomed, against every expectation, into genuine friendship between two peoples who had spent generations viewing each other as nothing more than rivals across a contested border. And Elena, standing beside Julian as the seasons turned once more toward spring, understood finally the full weight of everything that single, desperate choice in a stone chamber had set into motion. Not simply the saving of one beloved Beta's life, though that alone would have been worth every sacrifice, but the slow, patient uncovering of a truth that had threatened far more than either pack alone could have imagined. And the discovery, woven quietly through every difficult step of that journey, of a love neither of them had expected to find, forged not despite the collar she had worn so willingly, but because of everything it had eventually come to represent between two hearts brave enough to let an old grief become, in time, something entirely new.